Okay. Doug, you ready to get rolling?
Let's do it.
All right. First and foremost, thanks everybody for joining. We'll try to make this as valuable as possible, and a good use of your time. We also want to be, somewhat conversational. Feel free to ask questions in the chat. At the end, we'll also do a little bit of Q&A if you want. The goal today really is to talk through automating resilience in AWS workloads. We want to introduce a vendor that we've been working with, become a partner over the last 12 months or so, and ultimately, get through kind of an overview of what the platform is, the demo, and kind of the use cases and all that good stuff. So with that, Doug, I think we got an agenda slide next.
Yeah, actually, there's an intro slide next, I think.
Oh, great. Yeah. So Doug Newman, CEO and founder of Arpio. And I know most of you on the call. So Leon Thomas, chief strategy guy for Opti9. So for those of you that don't know who we are, Opti9 has been around for quite a while. We're the result of a merger between two companies, been in business over 22 years, both private and public clouds. We'll speak to that in a little bit more detail as we go forward. But with that, Doug, go ahead and move us to agenda. Really three core things we're going to hit today. We want to talk about cloud disasters and what makes them different from a traditional DR perspective. And what tools are in the toolbox around disaster risk mitigation. I'll spend a little bit of time on that and our experience there, and then a little bit about why Opti9 and Arpio are coming together and what that looks like in terms of options for you.
Fantastic. So, Leon, I really appreciate you guys having us join you today. I'm excited to talk through what we're doing and what problem that really solves. That really starts with understanding the disaster risk of workloads that run in the cloud in AWS. And I thought maybe the best way to do this would kind of be through stories. So I want to start by walking us through a couple stories about outages, disasters that have happened. These are all relatively recent, just to help people think about what do they need to be contemplating for their own resilience strategies. I think DR for on-premises workloads is a pretty well understood problem these days. But when you move those into the cloud and you inherit some additional resilience that the cloud platforms provide, you have to ask the question like, well, what problems do I now have to retain responsibility for? And I think this is a good way for us to kind of walk through that. So I want to start by talking about the most recent major AWS outage that happened. This was in December 7th. It actually occurred to me this morning. It was the anniversary of the Pearl Harbor attack. Not sure I should really be equating these two disasters, but all that said, back on December 7th, Amazon had a major outage of the Northern Virginia region of AWS. And what happened here was that they, throughout the day, routinely scale up and down their own services within AWS. And they had an internal auto scaling event occur. And somehow they scaled to a point that they triggered a scalability bug in their systems. And that caused a bunch of systems to flood a specific network segment with what appears to be DNS requests. And they effectively DOSed their own internal DNS services that are essential for running all of the services in the Northern Virginia region. The net result of this was that the control plane for AWS, the API surface area, was broken. And it was so severely broken that Amazon had a lot of trouble actually using their own tools, which build on their own platforms, to troubleshoot and discover what the root cause of it was. Most people at least know this because on December 7th, you couldn't log into the AWS console. There were some backdoors that might be able to get you into a different region of AWS, but the login page for AWS's console is hosted in the Northern Virginia region. So with that region being down, you had to know the special URL to get to another region. And then certain services like the single sign-on service for AWS lives in the Northern Virginia region. So you couldn't use SSO to log in. And so, lots of pain ensued for people during this day. Many companies were down entirely, especially companies who have very dynamic cloud native workloads that relied on this. And it was a 7-hour outage. So, I've lived through a lot of outages in my career. 7 hours is a very painful outage to live through. It's not the most painful outage. We're going to talk about some others that are a lot worse. But the thing that I remember from dealing with prior AWS outages is hour 1, you don't know that it's going to be over at 7 hours. Hour 2, you still don't know. You have zero control during these events to actually mitigate your own situation if you have not invested in that upfront. And so the way that companies sidestep this particular outage was to have a multi-region approach where they could move their traffic to a different region. And that's, as we'll talk later on, sort of an essential part of preparing for cloud outages and being resilient to these types of events. So I don't know, Leon, did you remember this event? Did this impact you?
Yeah, for sure.
Yep.
Yeah, we were definitely all hands on deck.
Yep. So that's an AWS outage. That's what I think a lot of people think about when they're considering DR in the clouds. What do I do if AWS is down? But there are probably a lot more companies that are dealing with ransomware and trying to understand their ransomware risk or return from a ransomware event these days. You hear about this a lot more often. And I wanted to highlight one that happened. This was also in December. Actually, it was spanned into January. A company that you guys may know is called Kronos. They do a lot of different workforce management solutions, things like time cards and punching in at employers and stuff like that. And they operate a lot of infrastructure for these services. Well, back middle of December, they were hit with a ransomware attack. And the end result of this, they actually have not been terribly transparent about what happened and why it took them so long. But the impact was that the services they provide to companies that support 8 million different employees were offline for 42 days in the holiday period when everybody wants to make sure they're getting their paycheck. And these companies that use the Kronos service were forced to go and invent manual processes for running payroll, processes that are perhaps error prone, that are slow to execute and delay being paid. So 8 million employees in the United States were effectively either not getting paid or getting paid late or getting paid inaccurately for a 42-day period here. And I think what's really interesting about this one is not just the outage, but rather the impact that this ransomware attack will have on Kronos's business. These are major companies that are using this service. I think this screenshot here talks about Tesla and Pepsi, who were unable to use these services during this period. These companies are currently pressing lawsuits against Kronos to recoup their own costs around these things. And I can't imagine a customer that sues your business intends to remain a customer. And so they will lose a lot of business as a result of this. And if you think about how this just represents what fundamentally is an existential threat for a business, where a ransomware attack might undermine their service so comprehensively that they probably a year from now or a year from this attack won't look like the same business that they were beforehand. And it's really all because they were unprepared to deal with a major ransomware event, and it took them 42 days to recover from it. So Leon, when was the last time you had to help a customer with a ransomware attack?
Last week, as a matter of fact.
Oh, really? Okay. So these are happening all the time. You can see a lot of them in the press, certainly when they're this big. You also don't hear about a lot of it because nobody wants to go raise their hand and share publicly that they've been the victim of a ransomware attack. But dealing with these can be catastrophic if you haven't really thought through it. And your disaster recovery strategy needs to contemplate recovering not just from infrastructure outages and data center fires and things like that, but also cyber events such as this one. So the next story I wanted to tell is actually extremely recent. They just resolved this one last week. This is a company called Atlassian that many of you may know and use. They build very popular tools for like project management and IT service management and software engineering efforts and things like that. And the beginning of this month, they were performing some maintenance operations, which involved cleaning up some data from a legacy service that they were deprecating. And they had a team that was producing some data that was an input to this process. It was the IDs of what data should be cleaned up. And another team was executing a script to clean up that data. And a miscommunication in that process resulted in the wrong IDs being provided. Instead of being the IDs for the specific data that need to be cleaned up, it was the IDs for the sites that hosted that data. The team then went and ran that script and accidentally deleted the sites of 400 of their largest customers. I think the number I heard was there's like 500,000 employees that were impacted by this particular 500,000 users. If you look at what a user is in the Atlassian system. Now Atlassian is a very mature organization. They've got a lot of IT processes in place and they have good backup practices. They also have a 6-hour recovery time objective for outages of these services, but their backup processes are more automated than their recovery processes are. And it turns out that 6-hour recovery time objective only applied on an individual site level. And when you have hundreds of these that are impacted at the same time, you can only do so many in parallel. It ultimately took them 15 days to recover from this particular outage. They are back online, so kudos to them. I'm sure that this is not a fun event to go through, but 15 days for a company like Atlassian to not provide service to some of their largest customers is another huge reputational hit. And it's, a simple miscommunication. There was no malice involved in this. There was no infrastructure outage. There just happened to be two teams that didn't communicate as effectively as they were supposed to, and resulted in this major event for them. I can't tell you how many times I've been involved in something like this in my career, Leon. I don't know if you've seen this before.
Yeah, I was just going to comment that judging by the names in the participant group here, I see several Atlassian customers. So
yeah,
it certainly can happen to anybody.
Yeah. So hopefully the participants here were not impacted by this particular outage, but if they are, hopefully they're at least happy to have their stuff back. So, so the last thing I want to talk about, this isn't really a story to tell about an outage, but this is really more something that's happening really relevant right now, which is obviously we're in a time of some global uncertainty, I'll call it. And the US government, the Department of Homeland Security has asked us as a community of, enterprises in the United States that operate oftentimes critical infrastructure or systems that support critical infrastructure to be on a heightened level of alert. So they've raised this Shields Up alert. They're anticipating that there is going to be an increase in cyber activity. And I guess in this case, it's state-sponsored cyber activity. And certainly that might look like ransomware attacks, that might look like other kinds of things, but we should all be right now anticipating what would happen if my particular properties got attacked, as well as what would happen if the infrastructure of our country got attacked. And if, for example, the power grid that happens to be behind a region of the country where we're operating a cloud workload were to go down for an extended period of time. And so I think it's a really good time to be thinking about what is our disaster recovery strategy? How are we prepared for these kinds of events? And how are we treating this with the appropriate level of urgency effectively? So that's kind of like, the landscape of disasters that I think that people really should be thinking about as they're wondering what investments should I be making as a company. And so the next thing I think we should do is just talk about how do we avoid these outcomes. If this were to happen to my organization, how would I recover from this? And that just gets us talking about what disaster recovery for a cloud workload really looks like. And so I want to talk about the three things that I believe and that we tell our customers are most essential for them to be contemplating when they're thinking about the resilience of their workloads. And it starts with good backup processes. And I think a lot of us benefit from the built-in backup capabilities that are in a cloud platform like AWS, and being able to turn on backup, or actually inheriting for free backup that's built into like a managed database platform or something like that. But what we really need to be considering is what would happen if we had a cyber event occur, or a malicious employee. There's some other stories I can tell you about employees connecting into environments and doing something unfathomable because they were upset. If they were to go in and compromise this environment, would they be able to find our backups? Would they be able to undermine our ability to recover from the event that's about to occur? Can't tell you how many times I've heard stories of people get ransomware, and the ransomware also encrypted the backups. And those encrypted backups are not valuable when you're trying to restore your data and not pay a ransom. So the essential practice here is to consider, how are we protecting those backups? Are we air gapping our backups and moving them into a location where a bad actor would not be able to get them? That location generally should be outside of your production environment, so that if your production environment is compromised, their backups aren't sitting right next to it. In AWS, there's a couple different ways you can accomplish this. And one of the ways that is most common, and what we advocate for our customers to do, is to move those backups into a different AWS account. That different account is a completely different security domain. The attack vectors that might let a bad actor get into your production account don't allow them to get over there. You don't need to share access to that account with anybody on your team necessarily if you've got an automated solution in place to be able to replicate everything over there. But fundamentally, air gapping your backups is an essential practice that everybody needs to be invested in if they aren't already. The second thing that's really important to understand is the level of redundancy that you have in your cloud workload. And there is a lot of redundancy built into the cloud platform, into AWS itself. In particular, when you deploy a workload into AWS, most workloads are deployed into a specific region of AWS. And within that region, they have a concept called availability zones. And these availability zones, you can kind of think of them as being independent data centers that are in the same general geographic region. They might be separated by miles or tens of miles or something like that. But you can deploy your workloads so that they run across multiple zones. And if you have a traditional data center outage, like a fire or a flood or something like that, that hopefully wouldn't be impacting multiple zones that you're in, and your workload could continue operating in that other. But the thing that's really important to understand is that availability zones still share a lot of foundational infrastructure. And this December 7th outage we talked about is a really good example. All of the availability zones were impacted by this control plane outage. The AWS control plane is regional. It's not specific to an availability zone. And therefore, didn't matter if you were deployed in multiple AZs. If your workload depended on the AWS control plane, then your workload was not going to work that particular day. Now, in addition to availability zones, there are multiple regions. And when Amazon builds regions, they build those to be completely independent. Each region of AWS has its own control plane. It has its own implementation of regional services like S3 or IAM or things like that. IAM is a global service, but there are regional footprints. But fundamentally, if you want to build to be resilient to any AWS outage in a region, you have to build to be multi-region. And you have to contemplate what would it mean for me to be able to recover my workload in a different region if my primary region were not available. The last thing that's really essential is practice. It's so easy for us to go and say, I turned on backups, I'm not going to worry about this problem. But then the actual disaster strikes and you find out that your backup process was not successful, or you hadn't turned it on for all of the pieces of your infrastructure that you needed. Or even though we have backups, we haven't practiced the recovery process. We don't understand what it means to recover 400 lost properties. We only know what it means to recover a single lost property, like the Atlassian outage there. And so it's really critical that you don't just invest in the backup process, but you invest and you practice the recovery process so that you know and your team is trained on what it takes to recover our service in the dire event where we need it. So if you aren't authentically testing your process by actually bringing up your service and validating that it works in its recovery form, then you can't know that you can recover it in the time objective that you specified. And you don't know what all of those steps are, and you don't know the unknown unknowns of your recovery process. So that's what we purport is essential for people to understand. And that gets us to what Arpio is. If I can figure out how to advance the slide. So what we've built with Arpio is intended to solve these exact problems here. So Arpio, the concept here is that you can go and invest in building out disaster recovery for your own workload, stitching together all the backup processes for all of the different services that you're using, understanding how to automate all of the infrastructure that would be necessary to recreate, or how to manually recreate that infrastructure in the event of an outage. But building disaster recovery is really not strategic for most organizations. Their time is better spent investing in the business and the things that will help them grow the business and win new customers. You have to have a DR plan to responsibly operate your infrastructure. But the best case scenario, you don't actually have to spend a lot of time on that DR plan. So Arpio solves this problem for AWS workloads. And really what we've done here is said, well, we can look at the AWS platform and we can see what does it mean for all of these 200 and so services that exist in AWS. What is the right strategy to recover that service from an outage? And if it's a data heavy service, then what does it mean to be able to back up that data? Or if it's an infrastructure only service, how do you automate recreating that infrastructure exactly as it was in its original environment so that what you get is functionally equivalent to what you started with, and you don't have to go and manually stitch back together all of those things. So Arpio gives it multi-region redundancy by default. You go into our console, and I'll show you this in a second, Leon. Check a couple checkboxes. Tell us which region you want to be able to recover in, and Arpio handles replicating everything over there and giving you the ability to turn that up in a moment's notice if you need it. But similarly, Arpio also protects your data so that you do have that air-gapped solution and make sure that you are resilient to some outage of your production environment that might undermine your recovery capability by attacking your backups themselves. And then lastly, the product focuses on automating all of this. So I often say, backup is generally always automated, but the recovery process is oftentimes very manual. And a lot of people I talk to are actually, you know what, if my services go down, it might take me a day to recover them. But that's going to be okay for the business. The problem is that if it takes you 24 hours to recover your service, it takes you 24 hours to test your ability to recover the service. And that is 3 full working days. And very few people have an appetite to actually spend 3 days uninterrupted, focused on a recovery process. So the great thing about an automated recovery solution is you can spin that environment up in 10 minutes. You can smoke test that in 10 more minutes, and then you can turn it back down. And 30 minutes later, you've exercised your full disaster recovery capability, and you know that it's going to work for you if you need it. So that is the idea behind Arpio and the automation that it brings. And I think what I really want to do is just kind of show it to you guys. So I got to figure out how to switch windows here. All right. So this is the Arpio console. And what I'm going to do is run through a quick demo, just how do you set up DR for a workload? And then we're going to come back and we'll take a look at some of these existing workloads. And actually, before I spend time looking at, let me explain what workloads I actually have in the demo environment so people get a sense for what's out there. So first and foremost, I've got a workload that it would characterize as sort of it's a cloud native virtual machine based workload. This particular workload is EC2 in the application tier. It's also using some managed data services on the back end. We've got managed databases, managed data caching. We've got a managed file server involved in this. The application tier is using auto scaling. So that's a more cloud native way to leverage virtual machines. But what Arpio does works just as well with static EC2 instances. And it lives behind a load balancer. And so what I can show you in the demo environment is how I can connect Arpio to this environment, just check a couple boxes really quickly, and everything is going to be backed up and replicated and recoverable within minutes. I've got the same application deployed. In this particular case, I'm using the Elastic Container Service. I don't know how many people on the call are investing in containerized workloads. What I've witnessed is that future thinking workloads, and I would imagine 10 years from now, most new workloads getting created are all running in containerized manner, if not a serverless manner. This here is the Elastic Container Service. It's the exact same software that we have deployed in the first environment. And it's talking to the exact same set of backend services, but it's just deployed in a very different architectural pattern. And Arpio can just as easily protect this entire workload as it does with the virtual machines. The third thing I have in here is a more traditional enterprise workload. You might think of it as just how you would manage any COTS application that you're running in the cloud. I happen to be running Active Directory on this one, but the actual software on the systems isn't what matters. What matters is that these are EC2 instances that we are hand curating, we are patching them, upgrading them, they are storing data, and all of that stuff needs to be backed up and dealt with in the event of a recovery. And with Arpio, I can just very easily select the servers in this environment and have everything backed up. And when I say everything, it's the pieces of infrastructure that you see here and the data they pertain. It's also everything that underlies that. So your security settings, your networking, your identity and access management, all that stuff underpins your workloads and has to exist. And it needs to be just as secure in the recovery environment is in the production environment. So you have to make sure that you've got a way to authentically replicate all of those things. And then, higher level constructs that you might be taking advantage of, whether it's a managed data service like RDS or Aurora or S3, or a load balancing component that you would have in play. All that stuff, Arpio can back up and be able to recover for you in the event of an outage. So jumping back over to the console really quickly, I've got those workloads defined over here on the left. I'm going to create a new one. And every application has a name. I'm going to call this the Opti9 Arpio webinar demo application, but you would obviously name this whatever you call your workloads in your environment. One of the essential things for you to understand when you're setting up DR is what is your recovery point objective. This is a metric that helps you understand effectively how frequently does my data need to be replicated so that if I do have to fail over, I've got minimal data loss as necessary. So I can specify recovery point objectives with Arpio of 24 hours if all you need is a nightly backup, which I would argue is not terribly aggressive. And I definitely push my customers to be more aggressive than that. Or we can do real-time replication with this. So if you need to make sure that no data is lost in the event of a failover, Arpio can orchestrate that for you as well. And it's essential to kind of understand what Arpio is going to be doing in that is leveraging the native capabilities of AWS to deliver on this. So for an EC2 instance, if you have a 24-hour recovery point objective, we'll create snapshots every 24 hours of the volumes on that EC2 instance. If you have a real-time recovery point objective, then we will orchestrate the setup, configuration, and monitoring of the Elastic Disaster Recovery Service in AWS to be able to ensure that all that data is replicating in real time. So I'm going to set this one up just for a 30-minute recovery point objective. And then I have a scratch pad on my second monitor with my account IDs. So I run my workload in this AWS account. I am running this workload in the Northern Virginia region, which is the US East 1 region. I'm going to set this up to go to a different AWS account. And this one here is going to be in, we're going to do this in the Oregon region. So cross account recovery, because that's how I get air gapping. This second account is locked down. Only Arpio has access to it. Nobody else, the attack vectors that allow somebody to compromise a production environment don't exist here. And then the cross region is what gives us the resilience to any outage in AWS, because each region is independent. And if we can fail over to another region, we won't have to deal with cascading outages across regions. So I hit next here. Arpio is going to go connect to the environment. We've got a pretty unique security model here where we're a SaaS product. So there's nothing to install and manage inside the environment. It makes it really easy to use, but we don't need privileged access to the environments that we're protecting. So we can't see customer data, we can't exfiltrate data out of their environments, and we can't do anything destructive in their production environments. And that just helps us make sure that there is, while our customers are trusting us, a third party, to work within their environment, they aren't granting us any privileges that would allow us or somebody that attacked us to do anything in their environment. So the last thing I have to do here is tell Arpio what matters. This is a small AWS environment here, but as I scroll through this, there's just a ton of complexity in any AWS environment. The cool thing is all I have to do is tell Arpio, like, I know that this load balancer matters. And Arpio knows, well, that load balancer, it points at an autoscaling group in this case. If it pointed at EC2 instances, it would automatically select those. It also knows, well, here's an SSL certificate that needs to exist. If we scroll down here, it knows, here's the launch template that needs to exist. This is a Linux machine image that has to be replicated to the recovery environment in order for us to recover the servers here. And all of the networking and security, and we get down here, we've got things like IAM, identity, all of that stuff, Arpio can discover and replicate over to the recovery environment, making it extremely rapid for us to set up DR and manage all that. So for this workload, I need this load balancer and all the compute behind it. I need this RDS database. Let's say it depends on this EFS file system, and I'll pull in this Elasticache cluster for that workload. And I just have to pick a few checkboxes. Arpio finds everything it depends on. And the whole point here is that you shouldn't have to grapple with the complexity of your cloud environment when you're thinking about disaster recovery. And if you make changes to the underlying infrastructure, you shouldn't have to go reconfigure your DR environment to also now back up those additional things. Arpio can go and just discover what's relevant in your environment and make sure all of that is backed up and replicated for you in minutes.
And for those of you that are on the call that are Opti9 customers, you've probably heard us sing the praises of tagging strategies and making sure that you've got your tagging strategy aligned with all the different pieces of automation that you want. In this world, you can leverage the tagging strategy that you have in place to automatically pick your prod environments as an example. There's a number of ways to do that. Just one more automation tip around a good solid tagging strategy.
Yeah, and I honestly usually find that people don't feel like they have a good tagging strategy. So if you do, you've got a leg up. You can come in here and just tell Arpio what tag matters. In this particular case, I've got a tag on these EC2 instances that are my Active Directory domain. And just by selecting the tag, Arpio understands what should it get included in there. So, and you can mix and match tags, and explicit selection is necessary to however you're managing the environment. I'm going to exclude those EC2 instances by deleting that tag, but come down here and hit finish. And we are done. Like, we just set up disaster recovery for a typical cloud native application. And it's just as easy to do a less cloud native application in Arpio. And Arpio is now going to take over and start continually replicating this to a different region and into a lockdown environment so that we can recover from any AWS outage, be it a 1 hour, 7 hour, 7-day outage, or some sort of cyber event like these ransomware attacks we've been talking about. So Arpio is waking up and doing its thing right now. In a minute, this is going to look more like this. And what you'll see here is this is the same set of resources. I'm taking these to the Northern California region, so it's a different DR configuration. But I've got my primary resources in the Northern Virginia region. Most of those are already up and running in the Northern California region. But resources that cost money, we don't need to operate until you need them. And say there's no reason why your DR strategy should double the cost of your AWS bill. So what we're doing here is bringing things like the load balancer, this RDS database, they aren't up and running yet. If I look over here at my Active Directory environment, all these EC2 instances are not actively running in the other environment. My NAT gateways aren't running. Those things get expensive, and there's no need to run them until you need them. So Arpio is not going to have them up and running. In the DR parlance, we talk about this as being a pilot light environment that is mostly available up and running. But in the event of a disaster, we're going to launch the remaining pieces just in time so that it's only during the DR or the DR test that you have to pay for it. Pretty typical that our customers tell us that adding Arpio to their environment only added 1 or 2% to their overall AWS costs, because all they're having to pay for is the cost of backing up the data into the other environment and storing that data there. So that's the nice thing about how quickly that happens. The last thing to really show you guys is, what does it look like if you actually need the environment? How do you bring it up? And how quickly can we recover this? And so I can just hit this test button to launch a test of the DR environment. I can pick which applications I want to bring up. And I can also roll it back in time. Like if I had a DR, a ransomware attack, I would want to get data that was not encrypted. So I need to make sure that I've got historical data in the recovery environment, and I can bring that stuff up at a point in time prior to when the attack happened. And in this particular case, I've configured this to keep data back. It looks like about 2 weeks here. But you can specify the retention policy as necessary to make sure that you've got the actual data retention capabilities that you need. I'm going to go ahead, though, and recover this at the December 27th timeframe. I hit test recovery, and Arpio is now going to bring up this environment. All those resources that were not yet up and running because we were not spending AWS cache are now going to come up. And these workloads will take about 10 minutes to recover. So a 10-minute recovery time from a major disaster scenario is, it's a pretty elite recovery time objective for disaster recovery. And really that it's only defined by how long it takes Amazon to restore the applications or to recreate the infrastructure that happens here. So that's kind of what I have for a demo, Leon. Anything else you think we should look at before we jump back to slides?
I don't think so. We did have one question that I can hit on real quick.
Yeah, great.
The question was kind of pre-demo, and it's a good one. And the question is AWS have they improved the redundancy in the control plane, APIs, SSO, et cetera, across regions so that it is less likely to happen? And the short answer is, we're being told steps have taken to mitigate the risks associated with a repeat occurrence. We've not been given any specific changes that have been made. Our opinion is this is a major architectural change. So for them to do something in the short term that would mitigate this across all of their regions is highly unlikely. We do anticipate there's some design changes in future state, but they've not given us any specific time frame for implementation of those.
Yeah, and I think just more in general, if you think about the kind of system that they run, like I doubt there's another infrastructure in the world as large as the Northern Virginia region of AWS. There's no way that you scale test an infrastructure of that size. And therefore, every time they make an augment or push something out, they are learning in the production environment about things like this scalability issue. I got to think that they didn't know that this would be a problem or could be a problem. And that really it's these unknown unknowns of the demons that live in our environments that we just have not discovered yet. And I'm confident that while they will react and do a great job of mitigating this particular outage, they don't know about the many other vulnerabilities that they have that they'll bump into over time. All right, let me jump back over to slides and we'll talk a little bit about what Arpio and Opti9 are doing together. So Leon, take this away.
Yeah, so as I mentioned at the top of the webinar, we've been working with Doug and his team for some time now, and have been fortunate enough to get to know not only Doug and the team, but also the application very well. And we've tested it in our environment, we've tested it in customer environments, and ultimately, one of the reasons customers work with us is to help sort of sift through the noise and identify best of breed and solve problems like DR and ransomware recovery. So we are tied at the hip, if you will, to Arpio, and have selected them to bring to market as our DRaaS offering for AWS, where we will implement this as a fully managed solution. So if you're a CloudOps customer with us today, that will be included in your CloudOps on a normal daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly basis. And then, we really worked with Doug and team to come up with a very simple, scalable pricing model that makes sense for everybody, eliminates some barriers to entry, and creates a great solution at a really important value point. Opti9 has about 20 plus years, 22 years, I guess it is these days, of backup as a service and disaster recovery as a service, both in public and private. I think one of the intriguing things for us is the level of automation and the level of dependency mapping that the Arpio platform provides. And ultimately, when you work with Arpio and Opti9, you get our expertise and our ability to help you in not only setting up your environment, but also troubleshooting and break fix type things. But we also provide access to AWS's enterprise support. So we've got a very deep amount of skill, expertise, if you will, that we can call on. And we saw a really nice opportunity to take a very well thought out product and help bring it to market. That's where we stand.
Awesome.
So as a kind of a thank you, if you will, for spending some time with us, we wanted to throw out an offer, and essentially what we're trying to accomplish is, again, get you exposed to some new technologies that will solve some real world problems. And in order to do that in a way that's a little more personal than we can be on a webinar, what we'll do is we'll actually engage and provide a no cost, no obligation introductory proof of concept, if you will. And out of that, you'll get a very clear understanding of what your current state disaster recovery scenario is and what your future state could be in less than 30 minutes, including a full test recovery if you want us to. And then we'll also provide, thanks to Arpio, a 30-day trial if you want to continue to run that environment once we've got it set up for you.
Yeah, I think I'm really excited about this. I hope the level of automation that we bring to this problem really makes disaster recovery something that is not a daunting investment for your customers, Leon. And I think that while DR is essential for people and for businesses to make sure that they are protected, it ultimately is an insurance policy. And nobody wants to spend their critical cycles building insurance. So if we can solve this problem in a general purpose way for these workloads and allow your customers, Leon, to go and invest their resources in the things that actually advance their business, I think that feels like a win-win. Hopefully they see it the same way. So.
Yeah, as somebody who has a lot of experience in implementing disaster recovery at various size organizations and various capacities, I can tell you that one of the value prop components here is really that picture of where we are today and where can we be with a relatively low amount of effort. If you think about, I often use the term tool in the toolbox, and you think about the current tools in the toolbox around private cloud, usually a disaster recovery plan, once developed, can take months to implement. So with this tool in the toolbox, we can take, in what we view as kind of a gap, you've got snapshot capabilities and there's elastic DR natively, but there's a big gap in terms of the way that automation plays and the value that it brings. And, ultimately to be able to do that in a very short period of time, is of significant value to us and obviously, hopefully to our customers.
Great. So I think we're at the end, Leon. And I think people are allowed to ask questions if they want to unmute, and we can talk through stuff. We've got another 10 minutes, I think, or so before we run out of time.
Yeah, perfect timing, Doug. And if you don't feel comfortable coming off mute and asking, feel free to hit the chat. But happy to answer any questions you have about Arpio or Opti9 or DR in general.
Hey,
This
is
Tim,
Real Radiology. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yep.
Cool. I was curious just about architecture questions, specifically the elastic IPs. Are those going to be, I'm guessing those wouldn't be transferred over to use this same elastic IPs. I'm guessing new ones would be created.
Yeah, unfortunately, we can't move the actual IP address itself.
Sure.
But what Arpio does do is create a new elastic IP in the recovery environment, connected into your infrastructure as appropriate. And what's really critical is we create that elastic IP when you first set up the DR environment. So you actually know the new IP address. And if you have places where in your systems you're configuring that, or maybe you have business partners who need to whitelist your IP addresses to be able to accept traffic, you can give them a second IP address and let them know that if we ever have a DR event, you'll see traffic originating from this other address. So that's generally the strategy that we've seen people who are building out DR themselves have needed to take. And it's what Arpio automates for customers.
Cool.
Thanks, Tim. Any other questions, or did Doug cover it all clear as day?
I guess a couple of further questions, just as far as configurability, and I was curious if it's on your roadmap to potentially offer like the choice of having paid services like EC2 instances running for quicker recovery times, or if it's unnecessary because of the kind of quality of the service already.
Well, I do think that if you're, so I would differentiate for you, Tim, the difference between a high availability and a disaster recovery solution. I think a comprehensive resilience strategy contemplates both. And if your recovery times are such that you can't afford a few minutes of launching an EC2 instance, which is how long Arpio would take in the event of a disaster, then you have to re-architect your applications entirely so that you consider multi-region high availability as the approach there. But that's an extremely expensive thing to do. Both, it's not so much about the AWS costs, it's the engineering time that goes into building that. So I would say the vast majority of workloads I've seen in my career, and certainly that we see with Arpio, are willing to deal with a few minutes of outage in the event of a disaster so that they don't have to go completely rebuild an application to avoid that.
Definitely. And then kind of from the opposite perspective, do you have any ability to configure in the recovery process to remove some of the redundancy that is built into the application, high availability, to reduce costs. Like, if we wouldn't need a load balancer, because all we really need is just a single instance running this thing, because the load balancer is primarily there for failover anyway.
Yeah. Yeah, you could do that. The way you would do that is just you would select the instance directly rather than selecting the load balancer. So you get to pick which resources are going to be part of your recovery plan. All that said, I think you might find that you're not going to pay for that load balancer and that second instance in the steady state case. You're only going to pay for it when you run it. So you're either running a test, which I'm purporting you can run a test in 30 minutes. Or you're having a disaster, in which case you're probably willing to throw a lot of money at getting back up and running. So I do have people frequently, usually the question I get is, hey, I don't maybe want the same instance types in my recovery environment when I'm running a test, because I want that to be, I don't need a C3 extra large in that event. But the answer I've always given, and I've never actually had somebody say, yeah, you're right, that wouldn't be a problem, is that you're only going to run that test for an hour or a day or something like that. That C3 extra large is very expensive when you're running it year round, but if you're running it for an hour, it's really not that big of a deal.
Yep. That makes sense. I think that's it for me. Thank you.
Thanks, Tim.
Well, I think it sounds like maybe we've exhausted questions, Leon. So I just want to thank the audience for coming and staying involved, engaging us. I hope that we'll get to meet each other in the near future with an actual real implementation.
Thanks all. Thanks, Doug. I appreciate the demo and the knowledge. We look forward to continuing to work together.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, guys.
Thanks all.
All right, bye-bye.